If you have a Bible with you, you can turn back to that passage that we just read in Luke 18. Now, I wonder what you think of yourself on the confidence scale. I'm always amazed at some people who seem to be so confident and they can just go into any situation and seem to be able to command that situation with their enormous brimming self-confidence. Now, I was, when I first went to Nepal as a 23-year-old, I was part of a team of people seeking to reach out to people in Nepal. And we had a week off during the summer, my first summer in Nepal. It was the monsoon, and my friend said, why don't we go for an inner tubing trip down the river Trisuli? Anybody who's been to the Himalayas might realize that an inner tubing trip on the river Trisuli during the monsoon might be more challenging than you had first imagined. I had no idea how challenging it might be, but my friends got a bunch of truck inner tubes, and we went in our truck that we had, drove out of the valley and down into the Trisuli Valley. It takes about 2 or 3 hours to drive down there, around about 30 hairpin bends. Get down to the Trisuli Valley, found a little beach by the side of the river, and got out the inner tubes, got in our trunks on, and then we kind of shared the inner tubes out among us. I was with Harsha, my Indian friend, and we said, okay, well, let's see how it goes. So we pushed off, holding the inner tube, and pushed out into this river. And immediately we got into the river, we realized, whoa, this is a full spate monsoon Himalayan river running down through this valley. And it was immediately sweeping us down the valley much faster than we imagined. So anyway, we thought we were going to be swimming to the other side, which was only about 50 yards away, but it probably took us 2 or 3 minutes to swim as hard as we could to get to the other side. And when we got to the other side, we thought, wow, that was quite an experience. Now we have to get back. And so we waited a few minutes and rested a bit, and then got back into the water and paddled across to the other side, only to just see at that moment 3 of our friends were sitting on an inner tube and making their way down the river and waving as they went. And we waved to them. And then as they went down, we saw they fell into the river. And that was when I heard one of my friends say, oh, Nayuza can't swim. That's another story for another day. I was confident that we were going to go into this river and just simply swim across it. But it turns out I was overconfident because I didn't realize how powerful that river was flowing. Now, false confidence can be fatal. And that's the message that I want to bring you this morning. False confidence can be fatal. Have a look at the story here in the first verse of the story, verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Now, these are not two things. It's not that there is one thing to be confident with of your own righteousness and also look down on others. This is one thing, because the result of being overconfident of your own righteousness, which means your right standing before God, if you think that of yourself you can stand before God with your head held up high, then this story is for you. Because if you're in such a position, you will also be like this Pharisee who was looking down on others. And Jesus has this story to tell to others. So righteousness then, just let me reiterate, righteousness is not a word that we tend to use very much, but it's an important word in the Bible. It means our right standing before God. Now we're told in the Bible repeatedly that God is holy. It's a really prominent message in the book of Leviticus, which was instructions for the people of Israel after they came out of Egypt and as they were traveling on their way to live in the promised land. Right in the middle of that book, God says, the Lord is holy. What does it mean to be holy? It means that God is set apart from everything else. He's different. He's different from the creation because he's the creator. But he's also different from humanity because he is pure and we are not. That's what it means for God to be holy. God is holy and we are unholy by nature. That means without God, there's something wrong with us. There's something that keeps us away from God and prevents us from knowing him. Now, in the Old Testament, that's the early part of the Bible from which we read first time. In the Old Testament, this is expressed in many different ways. And we read one way in which it's expressed about rules about how to deal with mold. Now, maybe you thought it was a bit odd that we read that passage this morning, but mold can be a big problem, can't it? Some of us live in very damp houses here in Wales and struggle with mold. We have mold in our front room and we can't seem to get rid of it. We've lived in the house 10 years. I don't know how many times I've worked to try and get rid of that mold. Now, the interesting thing is that these people are in the wilderness of Sinai when they're given these instructions. I don't know if you've ever been in an arid wilderness. After my first time in Asia, I drove home from Nepal back to the UK, and we drove through the desert of Pakistan in the summer. And it was hot, and it was incredibly dry. My eczema cleared up, my asthma cleared up. There were no allergens. No allergens could live in that hot desert environment. I would take my clothes off at night and would sleep in the van. And in the morning, my clothes were so dry, they were stiff. I could hold them upright without them falling down. That's how dry it was. No allergens in the wilderness, no mold, nothing that would make that would spread through your stuff. But it's in the wilderness that God gives these instructions. Why does he do that? It's in preparation for when they should go to the promised land and live there in the land of Canaan, where there was, which we are told was flowing with milk and honey, but also mold. And mold spreads, as we well know here in Wales, in places where there's abundant water and rain. So this was the instructions that God gave the people of Israel for when they were to settle in Canaan and how to deal with mold. Now, the important thing for us to understand is this. Mold in the Bible is a figure for sin. It's a figure for sin. What is sin? Sin is anything which makes us out of sorts, if you like, with God, which breaks our relationship with God. Sin is that which God does not want us to do or to be. We must not be sinful. God gives instructions for us to live pure and righteous lives. But we all, as human beings, have fallen. We've all rebelled against God and failed to live the kind of lives God wants us to live. That's because we are sinful people. That makes us sinful people. And this mold, this story about mold, these instructions about mold, are to teach us about how we should deal with sin. Now, sin is like mold in that it pervades our lives. It spreads from person to person. Have you noticed that? But it also spreads in our own lives. And if we don't deal with it, it can take over our lives. Maybe you're somebody who struggles with resentment or bitterness. Bitterness is like a root that buries itself. It's like knotweed, Japanese knotweed, that buries itself into our heart and makes it hard to get rid of. And it's like mold that spreads in our lives and causes spiritual disease in our lives. David said, "In sin, my mother conceived me." He was not saying anything about that his mother was a particularly bad person. He was saying that sin is so pervasive, it even spreads from one generation to another. And that's how it's always been from the time of our first parents, Adam and Eve. Such that we could read this morning as we started in Psalm 14, no, there is no one who does good, not even one. Now, you might take issue with that. You might think, but I know some people who are really good. But I would push back to you and ask this: do you know their heart like God does? They might on the outside seem wonderful people and such pleasant people, and yet God knows the heart, and God knows what the heart is like, not only of those wonderful people that you may know, but also of your heart and of my heart. There is no one who does good, says David, not even one. In the book of Ecclesiastes, which comes soon after the Psalms, we're told this: indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. And so the writers in the Bible are like one after another witnesses who stand in the witness box to show that we are indeed guilty before God. We are in the dock. When we read the Bible, we are in the dock. We are the ones who are charged with sin. And the Bible writers are witnesses telling us that, yes, we have indeed failed in so many ways. Now, sin also leads to other problems, other sins, if you like. One sin leads to another. And what we are told here in verse 9 is that for some people, there is a particular problem with a lack of self-awareness. Do you see that? To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on others, Jesus told this parable. So some people are lacking the self-awareness to realize that actually they are sinners. Now, this is a big problem. I read recently of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I wonder if you've ever heard about that. Two psychologists did a study of people's ability in grammar, logic, and sense of humor. And they studied a whole bunch of people, and then they ranked people on their ability of grammar, logic, and sense of humor. And then they asked those same people, how they perceive themselves to be in relation to other people. And what they found was that the bottom 16%, I think it was, the bottom group, the bottom 1/8, if you like, of all of the cohort of however many hundreds of people that they studied, they reckoned that they were on average at the 64th percentile. In other words, they were not only very poor in logic, grammar, and sense of humor, but they also had no idea how poor they were. They thought they were better than average. And in fact, that's very true, isn't it, of life in general? That most people believe that they're better than average at many things. And of course, we can't all be better than average at everything. That's not how averages work. My wife's a maths tutor, so if you're not sure about that, you can ask her. It works on a spiritual and moral level too. It's not just about grammar and logic and sense of humor. People tend to not realize how bad they are. It's like this. Imagine you're at a party and somebody in the party is a bit worse for wear. He's been drinking too much and he's really being quite obnoxious. Who is the last person in the room to realize that that man has been drinking too much? It's he himself, isn't it? That's how it is with sin. That's what Jesus says. He says, to some who are confident of their own righteousness. And he wants us to learn from that. So it's also true, he's saying, on a spiritual and moral level. Now, you might think, I don't do drugs, I don't cheat on my partner, I don't annoy my neighbors by playing loud music at night. You might think, I'm a nice person, I pay my taxes, I do the recycling, I volunteer at the local hospice. I'm a good person. Or you children. Maybe you're thinking like this too. Maybe you think, well, some of the kids at school are really awful, but I'm a good boy. I'm a good girl. I do the right thing. I do what my parents tell me to do. I help with the washing up. I tidy my room. I do my homework. And I obey the teacher, and I'm respectful. But do you look down on other people? Do you look down on the other children because they're not as good as you? If that is the case, then this story is for you too. So, this story, says Jesus. Let's have a look at it. Verse 10. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. So let me just, in case you don't understand, in case you've not come across this story before, or you're unfamiliar with the Bible, there are 3 things here that you might not understand. The first is the temple. Now, the temple was the place that the people of Israel had constructed for the worship of God. At the time of Jesus, this was the second temple that had been built. The first temple had been destroyed a few hundred years before, but when the people of God came back to the land of Israel, they were able to rebuild that temple. So this is the second temple that they had. And around that temple, there were various courtyards. Only the priests could go into the temple. But in the various courtyards, all the people of Israel could come, and even the people who weren't Israelites. And they could come and they could pray, and they could worship God in those temple courtyards. So that's the temple. Now, another thing that you may be unfamiliar with is this word Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were a group of people who lived in Israel in Jesus' day. They were very concerned to do the right thing. And they believed that if we did the right thing, if we obeyed God's laws, then they could make Israel a great place. They were the Make Israel Great Again party. They were very concerned that they could make Israel a great place. And so the answer to that, the answer to our problem, they said, is if everyone obeys God's law. And in fact, it was so important to them that they made extra laws to help people to obey those laws. Those were the Pharisees. And everybody looked up to the Pharisees because they were wealthy and they were, well, it seems they were good people, they felt. So this was the Pharisee. Now there's another person here, a tax collector. Now tax collectors were right at the other end of the social scale in Israel at the time of Jesus. You may know that at the time of Jesus, the people in charge of Israel were the Romans. The Roman armies had taken over Israel as they had taken over much of the Middle East. And they had subjected Israel so that the people in Israel had to pay taxes to the Roman authorities. They had to pay their coins into the Roman authorities. And the people who collected those taxes were the tax collectors. Tax collectors were Israelites. They were Jews. But they were working for the Romans. And so because of that, they were despised by the other Jewish people. There they were, these tax collectors. And they came to your town and they sat at their desk, and you had to come and give them your taxes. It was galling. It reminded you every time that your country was under the domination of a foreign power. Isn't that awful? And the tax collectors were working for the enemy. So they were the despised people, the Pharisees and the tax collectors. And they both went up to the temple. What do you think people were thinking when they heard this story? Let's move on. This is what we read. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. This is interesting, isn't it? That he stood by himself. You'll find out later that the tax collector is also standing. I guess there were no chairs. They were standing, but the Pharisee, we are told, was standing by himself. I wonder why. There would have been many other people who went up to the temple to pray, but the Pharisee was standing by himself. Why do you think that was? Was it because he thought of himself as a cut above all the other worshippers? He didn't really want to stand in line with the others. He didn't really want to identify with the hoi polloi, the general population, with their lack of law keeping. He was special, and so he stands by himself. And we are told he prays and he thanks God. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. So he's thanking God, isn't he? And it's a good thing to thank God. We all need to thank God. If we're not thanking God, then we're not really being appreciative of all his gifts to us. And on the surface, it looks like that's what the Pharisee's doing. It seems like a good thing. But actually, is it really giving thanks? Is he really giving thanks? It doesn't seem like it really, does it? Doesn't it come across to you like somebody in an interview with Alan Sugar on The Apprentice, saying all his qualifications, why you want me, why you should have me on your project? I'm the greatest guy. That's what he's saying. He's not really giving thanks. He's rehearsing his qualifications. Now, we need to be careful here, because it's easy to point a finger at other people, isn't it? There is an apocryphal story, as in, I don't know if it's true or not, of a Sunday school teacher who was teaching this story to his children, and afterwards he said, let's thank God that we're not like the Pharisee. It's easy to do that, isn't it? It's easy to twist this around and think, I'm the good guy and everybody else isn't. But Jesus is saying this because he wants us to think about ourselves. Maybe I'm like the Pharisee. Could it be me that Jesus is talking to this morning? The Pharisee is a member of God's community, the people of Israel. He's not an outsider. And so this message is not just for people who may be visiting us today and maybe not used to going to church. This message is for God's people too. Because God's people can be like this Pharisee as well. How about you? You're a member of this church. And yet you've got poor relationships with other people in the church. Maybe God's speaking to you about needing to sort that out. Or how about you children? You children, you sit here nicely. You're very good. At least that's what we think as adults. Your parents might know better. Perhaps you were fighting with your brothers or sisters before you came to church. You might seem like a good boy or good girl, but actually you're just as sinful as anybody else. Is that something you need to deal with, your children as well as adults? In this message here, Jesus is saying, stop faking it. Be honest with God. Let's move on. Verse 13. The tax collector now. He stands at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So the tax collector also stands. But he stands at a distance. He doesn't even presume to approach God close up, because he knows that he's deserving of God's judgment. He recognizes that he's a sinner in the sight of God, that he has failed in his life, that he has rebelled against God. And what does he do? He doesn't rehearse his achievements, but he merely casts himself on God. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. There's no negotiation here. You know, when there are two warring armies and they want to have peace, they can come together and have peace talks, can't they? And there can be a truce, a ceasefire, and they can negotiate how they're going to end the war. That's not how it is here for this man. He recognizes that he, as a rebel against God, it needs to come as if he has been completely defeated by God. And there is only one answer for him, and that is to plead for mercy. And that's how it is for us too, men and women, children. We need to come to God to plead for mercy. It's the only hope we have. There's no negotiation with God. Let's have a look at the punchline, verse 14. I tell you, says Jesus, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. What does justified mean? Justification is talking about God as the judge, declaring people guilty or innocent. God is a judge. We all one day will stand before God and give an account of our lives. Will we be guilty or innocent? By nature and by behavior, we are guilty. But Jesus is saying that this tax collector goes home justified. That means he goes home knowing that he has been forgiven, that he's innocent. He's been made innocent. Not that he's innocent of himself, but that God himself has made him innocent by declaring him innocent. That's what justification is. This man goes home justified. Not the Pharisee, but the tax collector. Maybe you're wondering or worrying, what will my mates think if I become a Christian, if I become a disciple of Jesus, if I decide that this is actually something that I want to be involved in, I want to follow God? Maybe you're thinking that. There's an old proverb in the Bible which goes like this: the fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. So you don't have to worry what people will think of you. God's got that in his control, and he will keep you safe. This justification, this freedom before God, this declaration of innocence is the pearl of great price. It's the treasure that's found in the field. Wouldn't you want to give everything you have to get that treasure, to get that pearl? And yet you don't have to. You don't have to pay anything. There's nothing you could give that would be enough for that. And you don't have to anyway, because Christ has done it all. He's paid for it himself by giving his own life for us. We sang earlier, there was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. He only could unlock the gates of heaven and let us in. Jesus only can pay that price, and we can be given mercy. We can be declared innocent on the basis of what Christ has done, not on the basis of what we do. So come to him and plead to him for mercy for your soul. Even this morning, you children, grown-ups, come to God. If you've never come to God before, plead to him for mercy. And we know that when we do that, we can go home justified as well. May God give us grace so to do.